Okay, today we are going to follow Miller's first steps as he came into Wairika and what events led up to his later life, as you've heard about today. This is Wairika in 1851, maybe 52. It's Minor Street looking west. So this is pretty close to what Joaquin would see a couple of years later, a little bit more built up. Dr. Fleming Hearn would describe Wairika, or Shasta Butte City, in 1851. Dr. Hearn was part of the 1851 gold discovery on Greenhorn and the Wairika Flats. The first miners lived along the banks of Wairika Creek, as that was where the water was located. At one time, tents, huts, were spread all along the banks of Wairika Creek, from Greenhorn Creek to Hawkinsville. Minor Street was the main route to the rich diggings, and that street developed first. This is Wairika in 1885. Heiner Joaquin Miller left his footsteps on these golden trails and events that would change his life, as you will see today. You'll see the trail from Wairika to Humbug, the Humbug Trail to Greenhorn, the Deadwood Trail, and the California-Oregon Stage Road. Miller would write in his California diary, "I reached Wairika on the 12th of November of '54. I spent the winter mining in that vicinity in company with some Oregonians that I'd formerly known. I made enough to buy me a good horse, a mule, and a good outfit, and in the spring of '55, I started for the headwaters of the McCloud River." Miller was no different than miners at that time, facing hardships, loneliness, depression, and thinking of going back home. But there's still all that gold out there somewhere. And what event would change Miller's life if he picked up a nugget such as that? Would that change his life? This is the overlay of Humbug City site, and you'll see the site of Humbug City and the forks of Humbug Creek. This, in the early days, was one of the most important points in the county. It was on Humbug Creek, a tributary of the Klamath River and about 10 miles from Wairika. The stream forks a short distance below the old town. And one of the many prospecting parties that roamed this region in 1851 found gold on the stream as early as the month of May. As soon as the first fact is known that the good diggings were found here, there was a rush of men from Wairika, and the stream was thronged with miners. More than 600 men were there that fall, and the general rendezvous was called Humbug City. Now, Miller's diary at Humbug Creek. Tuesday, January 1st, 1856. Yes, the 56th year of my life has passed away. And where or in what point have I gained? In none at all. I saved in knowledge of my weakness, failure, and irresolution. 1 year ago, I was on the Humbug Creek, Siskiyou County, California. And on that day, I took a review of the past year, 1854. And I said to myself, if the coming year goes no more usefully spent than the past, it will be a sin, and a great sin. So you can see he was faltering a little bit, ready to go home. He's feeling that loneliness. This is an aerial map of 2010 of the Humbug Trail to Humbug City and 2.1 miles to Frenchtown. This is Frenchtown. This is the site of Frenchtown. You see the canyon he was in. It was a lonely place over the hills. This is a monument at Frenchtown of the Humbug Mining District. It's in commemoration of prospects and miners and their settlements along Humbug Creek, Frenchtown, which is Maury Flats, Humbug, Humbug City, Ryderville, Plugtown, and the Howland Wilderness Saloon. immortalized by Joaquin Miller, was located here. After discovering gold in 1851, millions of dollars in gold were extracted along this creek and tributaries. And this, of course, dedicated by the Historical Society and the E-Campus Vitus. This is one to be really interesting. I took a picture of the site. Look at this horse walked out. Do you think this is the horse that Miller lost? He didn't steal it. He did lose one, didn't he? When Miller's in Wairika, he wrote, "When up and about, the man I'd met on the trail and who stood modestly in the background took me out and away over a snowy mountain to a new mining camp called Humbug Creek, where we wintered. Life was monotonous here, for we had to live alone in our cabin because of the intolerable toughness and roughness of the men here at the Fork, who made their focus on action and distraction in a howling wilderness saloon. Here I laid the scene for my famous play, The Danites, but have always been sorry I printed it." Now, Frenchtown was described by Miller owing to the number of Frenchmen working the claims. Now we're going to go back. We're going to go back to Greenhorn, to the Wheeler Trading Post. That's where those trees are at, was where the trading post is at, and the Oregon-California Stage Road turned at that point to Wairika. And Miller would go over that pass to Cherry Creek, to Deadwood, and McAdams Creek. Then he would arrive at the old town of Deadwood. Now, this old town of Deadwood is, if you notice a ridge in the background, keep that in mind, that ridge. We're going to tie this all together. 1851 to 1861, the town of Deadwood is at the forks of Cherry Creek, Deadwood Creek, which all become McAdams Creek. Deadwood, in its brief existence, was one of the most important business centers in early Siskiyou County. In 1857, there were 3 stores, 3 saloons, a dairy, a drugstore was owned by Dr. Daniel Ream. That's a good name, remember that, with Miller. 2 hotels, there were a few residents in the town. Most of the miners lived in tents, log cabins, and shelters of all types, scattered along the creeks and gulches. In 1856, the town was second to Wairika in population and cast 475 votes. At the county convention in 1857, Deadwood came within a few votes of winning the county seat. By 1858, the glory of Deadwood had begun to fade. On December 26, 1861, a disastrous fire burnt most of the town, and soon after, other fires completely destroyed the town of Deadwood. That's interesting, isn't it? This photograph of Miller's cabin was around 1906, was donated by the late Reverend George M. Muse, who was pastor of the Fort Jones Methodist Church 1905 to 1908. So he must have known Miller. Miller arrived at Deadwood, Siskiyou County, in 1856. Miller worked as a cook's helper at Deadwood. This early experience and observation was a basis for much as he wrote in his later years. Dr. Daniel Ream and Miller were good friends for a lifetime, probably treated him. Miller wrote his first poem in honor of the marriage of a Deadwood cook to a woman in Wairika. Miller recited his first poem at the reception given for the bride and groom on the return to Deadwood. It seems the story happened when Miller was newly arrived in California, when Miller attached himself to a group of 27 miners, including a preacher who knew Miller's father. Sometime around Miller's arrival in camp, a group of former convicts from Australia, including a homely woman, had come to Wairika area. One of them come to work in Miller's camp, and only on his second day at camp was found to be pilfering gold from the sluices, an offense punishable by death. Miller caught the man in the act and the miners rushed to hang that man that evening. Miller noted the man had a newspaper which inferred that marriage was a noose itself, and Miller then persuaded the miners to have the man marry the homely Australian woman as punishment. A different kind, really a different kind of noose, and much preferable to death. The accused man himself, gratefully relieved, sang out, "For a woman can do more with a man than a king and his whole army." There it is. Miller would write, "This was my first offense in the line of song. I did not know anything about poetry." This was the turning point that would change Miller's life from a miner to a poet. This is what it looks like today, Deadwood. That's the site right there. You're looking, keep that ridge in mind from the cabin and so on, the old picture. Miners' cabins were all along McAdams Creek. Miller would write 7 letters and poems starting in August 30th in 1857 to November 4th of 1857. Of course, another one of the community's most famous residents during the early years was a young Miss Lotta Crabtree, the darling performer of the Goldfields. After moving to California around 1851, she later moved up to the northern mines, landing in Deadwood, and over the Greenhorn Divide from Wairika. This is the I'm not going for some reason.
Frozen. Okay, I'm sorry. Looks
Just
like it froze.
Get that one right here. Yeah. There we go.
Okay, did you want to
Yeah,
go
that's
back
a
one?
dedication. That's all
Did
right.
you want to go back one?
Okay. That's a dedication. Okay. This is the miner's cabin, like I said, and he wrote all these poems. This is a dedication to the monument at Deadwood in 1948. Now we're going to go to the Franco-American Hotel. Joaquin was there. Miller spent some time here in the early days of the town and describes it as follows. A tide of people poured up and down and across the other streets. He's talking about Minor Street and the other streets. The white people on the sidewalks, the Chinese and mules in the main street, not a woman in sight, nor a child. Also, President Rutherford B. Hayes, the year was 1880, and it would turn out to be the last long-distance stagecoach trip ever made by a president of the United States. He was on a trip up the West Coast, and that President Hayes stayed one night in the Franco-American Hotel, and traveling with him was his wife Lucy, and his nickname Lemonade Lucy, due to her strong support of the temperance movement, and Union General William T. Sherman. Now, if you look at the stagecoach, you see the president. He's just starting to get out. That kind of beats Air Force One, doesn't it? Not probably as costly. Now we're going to go to the Donald Stower, Hawkinsville, California. This store is still in existence. Frank Riley, in the spring of 1858, he opened this store. And then he disposed of his last interest at Hawkinsville to his stepson, C. O'Donnell, which is Con O'Donnell. Like I say, it's in poor condition. I've been in it. My cousin lived in it. The Burgess is a very early family, and my cousin lived in it, and we'd visit him. Now, this is something interesting. This is a saloon in it. Could that be old Joaquin with his foot in the rail, having a drink? Well, we'll look at that a little later. This is the Donald Stower Ledger book with entries for items purchased by Joaquin Miller. This is the inside cover. The topper left, up there you see that Chinese writing. That's an ancient recipe for a medical recipe for Chinese. Wells Fargo, Sisson, Walker, Mount Hebron, lots of stamps in it. 1865. This book, they tore out some of the pages. Now the inside cover, here we go. As you'll see, Joaquin was there. He bought a harmonica. He paid his bill. Now that Miller would have a few drinks, food, and he did, like I say, he paid for his charges. There's 10 ledger book pages from December 6th, 1890 to February 5th, 1891. Now, did you see that boxed in Mrs. Kessner? I researched that name because every other day she come in and had a beer and a whiskey chaser sometimes and a brandy chaser. So I went and I searched out that name and I found, my goodness sakes, that's my good friend's great-grandma, George Walters. His wife was Helen Walters, our tax collector, and I took this book. I said, George, tell me about your grandma. He said, oh, she's an old German. They had a butcher shop in Humbug and moved to Hawkinsville. I said, she drink? He said, oh gosh, no, Grandma didn't drink. I showed him the book and he says, blank, damn, Grandma drank. The full circle in life comes around, doesn't it? One other interesting entry in it was merchandise for 500 cigars from the Sisson Cigar Company. Anybody hear that about hitting Mount Shasta? Now, this is the Hawkinsville Church. The population is principally Portuguese, who are engaged chiefly in mining. They are Catholic faith, and this church, which was converted from a brick building, erected in the spring of 1858 by Mr. Egert. And we've been in it on the tour. Now, this is interesting. This is Barron Stage Station, Mountain House, south of Ashland, Oregon, on the Oregon to California Stage Road. And this is an interesting, really interesting about Joaquin. It does following descriptions of the mail route between Oakland, Oregon, and Wairika, California, and incidents as related by William H. Byers, who carried mail over this route from 1856 to 58. The mail route was established in 1850. It's where I first met Heine Miller in the spring of 1858. He was walking the floor and trying to tie a Latin verb together. Nobody knew what he was talking about. Now, this is from Miller's unwritten history, Life Among the Modocs. Should you ever your fortune lead you to cross the Chinese wall that divided Oregon from the people of California, stop at the Mountain House and ask for the Old Mountain Trail. Take that direction and stop at the top what is called the first summit of the Siskiyou Mountains. For there you will see in the left hand by the trail a pile of rocks as high as your head, put there to mark where a party fell a few days after. And he's referring to in 1855 wagons hauling flour to Wairika, and the teamsters and the young boys was killed. Dismount, contribute a stone to the monument. It's a pretty Indian custom that the whites sometimes adopt and cherish. I never fail to observe it here, for this spot means a great deal to me. I uncover my head, take up a stone, lie it on the pile, then turn my face to Mount Shasta and kiss my hand for the want of some better expression. But kind of corny, but Miller does give a really important description of the old Trapper's Trail over the Siskiyou Mountains. The first and second summits of the Siskiyou Mountain is the old trail. On the Mountain Ashland Road is the toll gap where both the 1855 Territory Road and the 1859 toll road crossed, and Tunnel 13. The year was 1923, where the last great train robbery took place. This is from Mount Eddy to Mount Shasta. This really is not the end of Joaquin's footprints in Siskiyou County. Oh, I got to end. I was wondering what would happen to my life if I'd have found that nugget. Huh? What would happen? Huh? What would really happen if I found that nugget? Huh? Yeah, that is really an interesting nugget. That's Richard on the right. That mule takes a pretty good photograph, doesn't he? Thank you.
Good afternoon. This is a photograph I took from the summit of Black Butte with my wife Lori. We drove up last night from our home in Joaquin Miller Park, so on the border of the park in Oakland. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the Bill Muse and Chris very much for inviting me to speak today, and Jean Nels. Joaquin Miller's poetic vision was born at the inception of his literary vocation as a gold miner, journal writer, and poet shaman. By poet shaman, I mean a poet or prose writer whose vocation is to transport his or her audience into a shamanistic state of consciousness. Miller was, in my view, first and foremost a poet shaman. A visionary writer whose aim is to take the reader on a shamanic flight or journey to see the grandeur of the God of nature everywhere around us, and what better place to do that from than Mount Shasta. Here's an example of what I mean from Miller's California diary. This entry, written at McAdams Creek, Siskiyou County, California, September 5th, 1857, when he was 18 years old. Reader, whoever you are or wherever you be, you must go into fancies of flight with me. Over mountain and vale in fancy's flight, now pause half up Shasta's height. Here seat you on this throne of snow, and turn your wearied gaze below, on hill or dale or murmuring brook, and read God's name in nature's book. Pen and ink and scroll he brings along to paint in prose or stirring song, her thousands beauteous scenes below. On, brave bard, though your limbs you break, a few steps more, and on the topmost peak of the snowy white, bright, shining crown of California's proudest king. O thou mighty God of nature, God of all we are and see, creator of every land and creature, O lend a listening ear to me, for I have climbed these heights alone, and nearest now the heavenly throne. From the low, vulgar, contending world, I ask me, God, my thoughts to sway, and guide my pen to truths unfurled. In this poem, observing nature from a height can become a form of religious observation or prayer. One could say that in this poem, Miller's vocation was charted clearly before him like never before, to lift his mouth and to give praise to the Almighty God of nature, which happens to be the God of our American Constitution. Nature's God, as Thomas Jefferson put it in the Declaration. So to Miller, I think this was a symbol for divinity. So after I visited the Sisson Museum, which I had actually come to earlier, since 1996, we've been coming up pretty much every year. And I fell asleep with a view looking out on Mount Shasta. And at dawn, I had an increased insight into the source of Miller's vocation, which I think was to be a poet shaman. And also the power behind his poems, such as the one that I just read, namely what in Jungian terms is referred to as the projection of the Anima, or the soul image, onto a person. This was Sutatut, the Wintu Muse, or wife of Joaquin Miller. Such projections are not uncommon for poets of a youthful age. Miller was perhaps 15 when he met her and 17 when they married. The Anima, in Carl Jung's view, is one of the many archetypes that make up the structure and dynamics of the collective unconscious. She is a bridge to the deeper objective levels of the impersonal psyche in men, and to that place in the unconscious that's made up largely of God images and extends to the entire cosmos. As an image or symbol, the anima or soul image can lead the way to the highest realms of spiritual realization, or what Jung calls the self. As we've seen, Miller's symbol for this is located in his ascent up Mount Shasta, his prayer for poetic power offered to the god of the mountain. For Miller, such a visionary calling was evoked by his Wintu Pokwana, Sutatut, who was Achumawi. At the foundation of the anima image in a man's psyche is the instinct to mate, and this can be imprinted through the sexual drive or the mating impulse onto a specific locale or region. And in Miller's case, this was onto the teepee of the Great Spirit, the Mount Shasta. By the time Miller reached the age of 18, then he was what I view as a poet shaman. How did this calling arise in him? What events set it in motion? While seated in a cabin at Soda Springs with Joseph Doublooney, or Mountain Joe, some Wintu warriors from Castle Crags descended upon their quiet dwelling place and raided it of some of their supplies and possessions when the two men were gone for the day. Upset by this, Mountain Joe went downstream 20 miles or so to gather together some gold miners, and together this assembly of rude and gold-seeking men ascended with some guides and friendly Indians to Castle Creek, and then north to Castle Lake, a sweet, peaceful place overhung by mountain cypress and sweeping cedars. Miller narrates that this was the 26th day of June, 1855, and adds further, "This was my first warpath. I was about to take part in my first real battle. I could hear my heart beat like a little drum." The beating of the heart drum is a metaphor for a shaman's drum. It keeps beat with the seasons, the pulsating rhythms of the sea waves, stars, and cosmos. It also beats in tune with the drumming of war. During the Battle of Castle Crags, Mountain Joe attempted to lead Miller and his men in a raid against the Wintu people who were situated in the massive rock spires below Castle Dome, and Mountain Joe was struck violently across the face by a flying arrow. Miller claims Joe's eyes were so badly injured he couldn't see, and Miller was directed to lead the battle, the retaliation. Then suddenly, he adds, he could not see or rise. Miller was shot in the face. However, he fortunately lived to tell his story. which was told and retold for 58 years in a number of different versions. The tip of the arrow had to be cut off and then pulled back through his neck from the shaft penetrating his cheek area. The wound was so close to fatal, it marked him for life. As a physically and psychologically real shaman's wound or insignia of a wounded healer, a person who is called by vocation first to heal himself and then to offer a cure to his or her culture, which in Miller's case was the world. By the time he got to the heights, he really saw himself as an international bard trying to reach a transnational community. In Miller's case, so I've looked at many of these accounts, and there's a number of them. I've seen at least 8 or 9 different accounts, and both through his poetry and prose. Yet there's a couple of accounts that some of you may not already know about. So let's take a look at them before moving on into his poem celebrating Shasta's native peoples. This one is from Overland in a Covered Wagon, his autobiography narrative, 1909. Suddenly there was another deluge of arrows, and I dropped at his side. I felt no real pain, as one would think, with an arrow thrust through the side of my neck and face till the point stuck away out the back of my neck, but I was stunned. It seemed to me as if my head had been crushed, and I remember putting my hand up to feel my head. This was perhaps because the arrow had pierced so nearly the base of the brain. I do not remember anything else about that day, and very little about the next year. In fact, my memory and in truth, all my faculties failed me for so long after that. He's very lucky he didn't suffer from brain injury, a serious brain injury, because it missed came out the back of the neck, but missed the lower brainstem. The disabled men were carried down from out of Castle Rock by women prisoners. The one who carried me on her back had lost both her boys and husband in the battle. She was not kind at first. They tied my head close to hers so that she could steady it with her hand. Then I talked to her in her own tongue, which I had learned very perfectly from our Indian children. She then told her sorrows and said I must be her boy in place of the ones killed. They laid me under some cedars down by the Sacramento River, and the Indian woman was truly a mother to me. But when spring came and Mount Shasta stood out white and glorious above the clouds and beckoned me, I hailed him as a brother. I too would rise above the clouds that mantled me, and in spite of protests would slip away and join my red men once more at his feet. My wound in the face and neck were still serious. I could not lie down, but took such rest as I could get in my rovings among the Indians, half reclining against a tree in my blanket or skins. I was like a real Indian, but how kind these people were, how considerate. I was a babe, and they treated me in my weakness as if I had been newly born into their tribe. So based upon my comparative studies of Miller's self-reports of his face and neck injury, this account sounds very consistent with other accounts. But here, in his autobiography, published in 1909, the memories of his trauma appear to be more fully integrated into consciousness, and the earlier memory loss of parts of the experience that previously were dissociated from consciousness were made available again. Typically, the blocking out of fragments of traumatic episodes from consciousness are attributable to emotional numbing and fears of reliving a terrifying experience. And the haunting memories are for a time compartmentalized through dissociation. Through corrective psychotherapy, such memories may, however, under the right conditions, be brought back into awareness. Dissociated emotions can then be assimilated into the personality as a whole, with the integrity of the full spectrum of emotions more completely intact. Prior to the advent of psychoanalysis at the turn of the 20th century, automatic writing and other methods of therapy were used in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. by the French psychiatrists Jean Charcot and Pierre Janet in Paris, by Freud and Jung in Vienna and Zurich, and by William James in America. Miller appears to have been aware of the curative power of poetry as a visionary technique in the treatment of his own traumatic injuries. As he says above, the Indian woman who carried him down from Castle Crags told him he must be her boy in exchange for the ones that had been tragically killed. Such passages describe an experience of death as a 15-year-old white male and rebirth or second birth as a son of Wintu culture, or a second sonship as a Wintu-speaking and American English-speaking shamanic poet. Miller's initiation from one identity into another was marked by one of the most painful starts in a literary career one can possibly imagine. From all accounts, Sutatut played a pivotal part in Miller's change in consciousness and character. As his Wintu muse, she helped him discover the healing value of poetry therapy. Miller was nursed back to health after the Battle of Castle Crags by Paquita, or Sutatut. In a description of her in old age, Miller said of her after her death, "Although Indian-born and without the so-called advantages of civilization, Sutatut, my dead Indian friend who nursed me back to life in her wigwam after I had been shot down by the hostile Modocs, had a soul as white as the snow-covered summit of Mount Shasta. I again repeat that no woman on earth, whether white or red, had a nobler soul than Sutatut, and I mourn her as one of my own people." It appears from all records that Sutatut nursed Miller back to life, yet this letter shows how closely his praise of her is connected to his poem that I read earlier in celebration of California's proudest king. There is an equality being made here between Sutatut's soul and the white-covered summit of Mount Shasta. Thus, this poem in praise of Mount Shasta is also a poem in celebration of his love for his muse. As it turns out, this tribute to a Wintu woman turns out to have been initially written as a lament. As far as I can tell, Joaquin Miller is the only Caucasian poet-shaman in the far west who wrote in part Native American tongue. At least one of his earliest poems were written in American English, interwoven with Wintuan-sounding words. These words were imprinted on his memory in the aftermath of the Battle of Castle Crags. In dirge-like songs, he heard from the wailing of the Wintu women that had lost their braves during the tragedy. In the following poem, recorded by Juanita Miller, this is his third daughter, in her book My Father, Cincinnatus Heiner Joaquin Miller, Broken Arrow Poet, which is a name he got from Waritotut, the either father or grandfather of his wife, we get a sad account of Miller's experiences that take us deeper into the mystery of the source of his vocation as a poet-shaman. Listen. Signal light on topmost height, white men in valley below, he no no, he no no, he no no, no, no. Signal light gone, dim gray dawn, red men and white are dead in valley. He no no, he no no, he no no, no, no. So I don't know Wintu, but I can hear the grief in these downward beating lines. He and no are earth words. He is repeated 6 times, no 8 times. Can you feel the beat of the rhythm? Miller was in touch with real primal energies when he lived here, and I think that comes through in this. 6 and 8 equals 14, a shamanic number in tribal mythologies across the planet. In fact, the signal for ending a drumming and visioning session in contemporary shamanic circles is 7 quick, sharp beats of the drum. So he seems to be in touch with something here, or he's repeating what he heard from the Wintu women who were chanting or lamenting, really. Here, signal light on topmost height is the light at the summit of Castle Dome. When white men are down in valley below, the first 7 beats represents the light of the sacred protectors of the crags. The second 7 beats represents the disappearance of the light and beginning of horrible darkness for Wintu-speaking people. Signal light gone, dim gray dawn, when red and white are dead in valley, represents the end of the battle, after the point when the Modoc arrow was cut off, pulled out of Miller's face by its feather end, and he could see clearly once again. There's a contrast between vision and blindness, seeing and not seeing in these poems. Miller makes it clear in describing his experience that it was not so much the visual aspects of the battle scene that traumatized him, as much as the death songs of the women and children prisoners as well, who were chanting for their dead. We hear this in the chant lines he preserved for us in 14 beating syllables. He no no, he no no, he no no, no, no. He reports that he suffered from haunting memories of the trauma in the chants he heard, and from intrusive recollections of the battle through post-traumatic nightmares. Writing this poem down helped him get the thoughts out of his system. My nervous system was so shattered, I could still hear the cries of the Indians. He no no, he no no. After I had composed my thoughts into a poem, however, I seemed to get it somewhat out of my system. Yet sometimes I would yell out in my sleep and then feel a soft hand on my mouth and be given a quieting herb. So I've written in my book, William Everson, The Shaman's Call, about the origins of shamanism in California poetry. Yet in this centennial talk on the poetry and praise of Mount Shasta and its native people, it has become clearer to me than ever that it was Wintu women that initiated Miller into his calling as a poet shaman, because it was from them that he heard this kind of chant that stayed with him. It came to him by way of these chants, listening to the grief songs of the Wintu. Yet while Sudetut may have nursed Joaquin back to physical life, it is equally certain that the ultimate healing of his shaman's wound came about through the writing of poetry as a form of self-cure. And as Bill mentioned this morning, he was writing virtually every day of his life practically. I mean, he was so prolific. The poet shaman is a sick man or woman who has healed him or herself through various techniques. In my talk tomorrow afternoon, we'll explore Miller's 7 days writing in the cabin he built on the Great Spirit's teepee, or Mount Shasta, that led to his deeper initiation into the mysteries of the ancestral region that we are now sitting in, Mount Shasta. Thank you.
So just a couple of definitions. Land use conflict, what would that mean? That means that it's two different views about how land may be used. So for example, should it be used for farming or fishing? Or should it be used, can you hear me okay? Should it be used for environmental protection, or should it be used for economic gain? And so that's the basic concept of land use conflict. I'd like to say that I will use the term Indian through the talk, and that comes from having been an idea from Stephen Pivar, who is an attorney who specializes in Indian legal cases. His use of that is related to the fact that most laws refer to Indian. So it's the Bureau of Indian Affairs, it's the Central Valley Project Indian Lands Acquisition Act. So with respect, I will use the term Indian. So what do we think when we are talking about a map? Well, we're talking about something that's verifiable, that it's useful, that it is reliable, that it can be repeated. But we also know that a map is a reduction of space. It's a representation. It's been selected and symbolized. And so what we also know about a map is that it is a social construction, and that social construction is a matter of choice. It depends on what's included. It has an agenda and an argument, and it is also a way of understanding more about the values, imagination, and drive of the culture that created the map. So we are talking here about Joaquin Miller and his time in California, and we think of California and its entry into the United States as a territory and a state, and if we use that as a starting point, then it can be hard to put into context where did this come from? How did this story take place? And I'd like to propose that this is an actual longer story, that this is a story that had been going on for about 350 years by the time we see the Joaquin Miller entry and California becoming a state. So just to take us back a little bit, the United States, or North America, once the Europeans discovered it, North America was just such an opportunity for Europeans. It was a place that was full of riches. After Spain started to come to the New World, they became the richest country in Europe for quite a period of time. The Spanish were first in the Americas, and you can see their route going north. You can see the Russians on the west, and you can see the French, English, Dutch, even the Swedish on the east. All of them used maps as a way of representing what their claims were, and all of them respected the maps that were used and included them in treaties that recognized the territorial boundaries of nations. But the territory that the Europeans came to was not an open, unused land. It was fully occupied, and it had it was populated across the land. It was full of nations that used all of this as their sustenance, as their cultural values, as their spiritual significance. And for each of them, this land was as precious as it would be to the future Europeans. As the Europeans found their way into the New World, going from the coast, they would go further and further into the interior, the way always led by explorers, missionaries, and fur trappers. This is a map that shows where the fur trappers set up sites. They had trading posts, and you can see that they follow rivers. So even as they would explore away from the rivers until railroads came into existence, beginning in the 1830s, but really covering the continent in the 1860s, rivers were the way that you managed to move any kind of move yourself and move anything that you were trying to transport, unless, of course, you were relying on the mule trains. You can see that in the California area, there are no fur trading posts in the early days. Maps not only represent what exists, but they represent and bring our imagination to what could exist. So this map was created by John Mellish after the War of 1812. John Mellish was a famous cartographer published in Pennsylvania, and this was a large map intended for public display. Originally, his intention was to show the United States and its territories and its neighboring territories, or its neighbors, Europe, Great Britain, and Spain, and it was to only go to the Rockies, but at the last minute he thought, I will take it all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And after it was completed, he wrote, "The map, so constructed, shows at a glance the whole extent of the United States territory from sea to sea, and in tracing the probable expansion of the human race from east to west, the mind finds an agreeable resting place on its western limits." This visualizes what eventually became Manifest Destiny and gives us a way of seeing ourselves as something that goes from east to west, and of course, eventually seeing that into fruition. So, the Oregon Trail is one of the longest overland routes. It was first traced by explorers and fur traders beginning about 1811. Once again, the missionaries and the fur traders were the ones that really pulled people to come across this arduous 2,000-mile journey and set up places in Willamette Valley. Both the mission and the Hudson's Bay Company coexisted in that valley. There were several government expeditions that explored and mapped parts of the trail from 1832 through 1848. John Charles Fremont, and then a second lieutenant in the Army Corps of Topographical Engineers, led 3 major surveys in 1842, 43, and 45 to the Rocky Mountains, Oregon, and California. If we go down and see what was happening in California, it wasn't really until the 1820s that the fur traders really started to penetrate the interior of California. The California, we know that the Spanish set missions, but the idea that the Spanish or the Mexicans were in California is a misunderstanding unless you realize that they were primarily along the coast. Their military expeditions would go into the interior, into the Central Valley periodically, but the real settlement for Europeans was really along the coast. The Russians came along the coast down from the north as far as Fort Bragg, but by the 1820s, then we start to see fur trappers coming, and we start to see settlers coming, both American and mostly American. And because, well, in 1821, when Mexico won the War of Independence from Spain, and they were seeing the settlers coming in, they were concerned about losing control of the territory. And so they were willing to give land grants in exchange for becoming a Mexican citizen and pledging allegiance. And so that they gave out about 800 Mexican and Spanish land grants before, while they still owned the territory. Again, this is not an empty territory. This was fully occupied, and Robert Heiser writes about the Stephen Powers map, which was published in 1877. There must have been an incalculable loss of ethnographic fact between 1769 and 1850 due to population decrease from about 300,000 in 1769 to about 100,000 in 1850. The 1850 population was at least halved again in the ensuing 20 years, so that by 1871, when Stephen Powers began to collect the data that appeared in his Tribes of California, there were only living about 16% of the native Californians who were present a century earlier. So I want to talk a little bit more about the land grants, 2 in particular that were very important. The first one is where we see this present city of Sacramento. That one was that was the first and most famous American land grant, John Augustus Sutter. It was Rancho Nueva Helvecia, also known as Sutter's Fort, 48,000 acres. And it was an essential center for information and supplies, and it was a permanent white settlement in the Maidu and Wintu territorial areas. Just a word about what the land grant meant. It's not a form of holding title the way we hold title under the American system. Under the French and Mexican system, it was more of a governorship. And so the governor or the ruler, the landlord of the land grant was entitled to the taxes and the revenues and the fruit of the area, but the land was still owned by the original people, by the Indians. So the second land grant that's important in this conversation is Pearson Barton Reading, who was a fur trapper who, after he had returned from a fur trapping expedition up the Sacramento River, became a Mexican citizen and applied for and received a Mexican land grant called Rancho Buenaventura. It was 26,000 acres, and it was 3 miles along the west side of the Sacramento River from Cottonwood Creek to Salt Creek. And today's city of Redding is at the north end of that. This is in Wintu territory, and Reading wrote that he had 2 Indian tribes on his land, each of about 150 men, women, and children. And then you can see that both of these land grants are well positioned, both for the gold discovery, both for acquiring gold and also becoming trading posts for miners who are going to be looking for supplies. Just tying things together, this is a detail from Fremont's expedition in 1842, and it shows him going from Oregon through the Klamath Basin area and down into Sacramento area, and a place that he stopped and stayed at for a couple of weeks and repeatedly visited was Nueva Helvetica. It is a connection that Sutter and Fremont had that was established early in the 1840s. All of this was important during the Bear Revolt, and the Gold Rush, treaties with Indians, and the push to become a state. By 1848, Manifest Destiny has been fulfilled, and the Mexican cession after the Mexican War has ceded California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, the western portions of Mexico and Colorado, and even part of Wyoming to the United States as a territory. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo called for the recognition of existing land titles, and it called for the people in the ceded territory to be accepted as citizens. And all of this might have gone very smoothly, and California been part of a territorial government in which there would have been an orderly land survey done, and then it become a state. But of course, that wasn't orderly because the gold rush happened. And suddenly, we can see that the Oregon Trail, Fremont's expeditions, Reading's and Sutter's land grants have a new importance in this new world. So, while a land is territory, one cannot assume ownership of the land. You don't get the title. You have to wait until the territory becomes a state, until it is surveyed, and then you petition for the patent, and then the patent is granted and you hold the title. In order for that to happen, the process called for the land, the Indian land, to be a treaty negotiated. It was a cession treaty, meaning give up land, and a portion of that land that was given up would be reserved. So when the boxed area, this is the area that was negotiated, this is the treaty that was negotiated in Cottonwood at Reading's land. And the area, the blue area, 294, is the area that would have been ceded, and all Native people would move to area 293, which would have been the reservation. If you look in the lower section there, you can see Reading's land grant in relationship to the treaty. So had the treaty been ratified, Reading's land grant, which is, as I said, I think 28,000 acres, is next to the reservation. The reservation was chosen for that area, not blindly. It was a defensive choice to put it there. And written about that was, "They do not lack the nerve and daring of the best Atlantic Indians. Once accustomed to war, their mountain fastness would be impregnable. Our policy is to get them down to in reservations along the foothills bordering on the plains, with the miners between them and the mountains, forming a formidable cordon or barrier through which it would be difficult to take their families unobserved, and where there would be no place for concealing stolen stock." So after the reservations were created, after the treaties were negotiated, they were sent, all 18 were sent back to Congress, and Congress did not ratify them. One important thing to know is that the two first senators were John Fremont and William Gwynn. And listening to opposition from California citizens, the senators lobbied Congress to not certify the treaties. The treaties were not certified, and they were filed under an injunction of secrecy. So California then did not intend to follow the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which said that we will recognize California Indians as citizens, and they did not intend to follow the treaty process, which says that a treaty has to be notified. So how are they going to handle the land acquisition? What they did was they passed an act to ascertain and settle the private land claims in the state of California. It was passed in 1851, and there were 5 years to file a claim. And only those claims that were recognized by the court were then accepted as legitimate land claims. So no Indians filed. Many of the Spanish, even if they understood that this was the case, thought that the treaty had protected their land rights. Many of them did not file. All the publications were in English, so most of the people who filed they spoke English and were American. Both Reading and Sutter's land grants were accepted, but it took an average of 17 years for a claim to be processed from the petition to the patent. So squatter troubles were very, very common in the 1850s and 1870s. California became a state during a period of time. Federal Indian policy changed all the time, and it was a period where everybody believed that, or the federal policy was relocation of Indians. They had been previously moved west. There was no place west to move them, so mostly it was an ignored issue. The surveys went ahead, and you can see, this is a plat book. It's just a page from a plat book, which is what the surveys were written on. So this represents a township and range, and it has the 36 sections that would have been in that township and range. The paper shows it as flat, but you can see that the terrain in the area was very, very mountainous. And so what you saw on paper and what you experienced in the land was two different things. And I think, as Julie said yesterday, it was the mountainous area that protected Indians in Northern California for a period of time. Also, until the railroad came in, this land was not desirable land except to miners or those who, a few trappers who were fur trapping. So that was another thing that protected some of the Indians in this area. It was a refuge for them. But while the surveys are going on, the railroad is coming along, and the Homestead Act, so nothing has been settled. Land title is hard to come by, and then, but progress is being shown in the maps anyway. So the maps, what we see in Mitchell maps, 1847 through 1854, is that they show tremendous progress. Again, maps showing, leading the concept that the area has been settled and is open for, open and inviting and ready for you to come along and join as a new settler there, whether to become a farmer or a miner. It invites the idea that this is now, we've moved away from Indian territory into the public domain and are ready for all of you to come and join us. This is a summary of what the reservation, or the distribution of land from the public domain looked like by 1880. 16% had been distributed to railroads, none to reservation land, 3% to homesteads. Had the treaties been ratified, it could have been as much as 7% of the public domain land. But everything about the way people came to California, the way the laws were managed, the way land was distributed, of course led to land use conflict. It led to conflict not only between the new settlers, no matter whether they were farmers or miners, and the Indians. It led to conflict between the pioneers who were here early and squatters. It led to conflict between railroads and farmers. It was conflict all around. But much of what we know about that period didn't come exactly from that period. It came from research. And this is a map that Margaret Guilford Cardell created by taking unpublished information from Jeremiah Curtin and John Harrington, their work in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and finally putting that onto a map from text data and then visualizing that in the 1980s. So many of you continue to do research and deal with original material and create maps. The Indians, of course, also continue to exist, whether they're recognized or unrecognized. In the United States, there are 560 recognized Indian tribes, but there's also 332 unrecognized tribes. 74 of them are in California. The cession and reservation boundaries associated with the unratified treaties were laid out for the convenience of the negotiating agents. They were never based on tribal territory, and if they were distributed at the beginning of the distribution of land, there was never an opportunity after that to create reservations of the same size. The Public Land Survey was used to patent land for the railroad companies, homesteaders, miners, and other interests. Indians were considered wards of the state. They weren't citizens, and so they have no opportunity to earn money through mining, through timber, through farming, through land distribution. Just in summary, maps contain partial truths, and there's interpretation of how maps were made contributed to mapping the California Indians out of legal existence, while it mapped in new ownership and a new civilization. So here's a partial list of references, and if there's any questions or comments.
Tom Stokely, as they said. And while I do work for a nonprofit called the California Water Impact Network, I'm not here representing Seawind today, as we're known as. I'm not an expert on Native Americans, and I'm not an expert on Joaquin Miller either. In fact, I just read this book that Bill Meese loaned me, Life Amongst the Modocs, An Unwritten History. But my talk is based on what I found in that particular book. And I'm not here to blame or condemn anybody for anything that's gone on in the past, but simply to relate what's happened in the past and what's happening currently and how we might be able to move ahead. To me, Joaquin Miller was sort of an early James Michener. He wrote his books based on real experiences, but he allegedly or apparently embellish the truth sometimes, or maybe change the facts to protect the innocent, or maybe the guilty. Obviously, Mr. Miller had sympathies with the Native Americans of the area, having lived with the Wintu for a while, and yet at the same time he also participated in the massacre of some of the Pit River Indians. So he was a man of many faces, perhaps. He did talk in his writing about the extensive abundance of fish and wildlife in the region. I've seen between the Devil's Castle and Mount Shasta the stream so filled with salmon that it was impossible to force a horse to cross the current. Of course, Devil's Castle was Castle's Crag. Also, talking about his days on Humbug Creek, elk came down from the mountain towards spring, and we could shoot them from the cabin door. At this season of the year, as well as late in the fall, they are found in herds of hundreds together. Obviously, the native fish and wildlife were very important to the Native Americans in the region. And Miller seemed to understand some of the reasons for the bad blood. Oh, and one other thing is also something that some of us forget sometimes is that Mount Shasta is even now, in one sense of the word, an active volcano. And he talked about some of the Native American legends and how the Creator made his home inside of the mountain, and so when it spewed smoke and fire, it was just the smoke and fire from his fires in the mountain. Miller also understood the reasons for the bad blood between the tribes and the white men. He noted in particular the massacre of the Modocs by a gentleman by the name of Ben Wright, who signed a peace treaty with the Modocs, then gathered them all together and massacred them. Miller claimed that that was one of the big reasons that Captain Jack became aggressive later on, and he was motivated by revenge for the massacre. However, Miller also noted that one of Captain Jack's motivations was that they were going to move his people, the Modocs, in with their traditional enemies, the Klamath tribes, and that they were facing starvation. And Miller very accurately portrayed the strategy of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the settlers to exterminate the Native Americans here. Month by month, the game grew more scarce, shy and difficult to take. The fish failed to come up from the sea through the winding waters of the Sacramento, now made thick with mud by that should be miners, and starvation stared them in the face. And of course, he also talked about how the Native Americans were prohibited from obtaining firearms, and they had a very difficult time competing with the white people for game. And of course, the rest is history. Native Americans died by the thousands, and the remaining members of those tribes were put on reservations. Interestingly enough, even though Captain Jack with the Modoc tribe, they were thrown in with the Klamath tribe, their mortal enemies, and to this day, the Klamath tribes are actually a consortium of 3 different tribes: the Klamath, the Yehuskin, and the Modoc tribes. We also have several recognized and unrecognized tribes in the region. I was always taught to list tribes in alphabetical order, and I may not have done it correctly here, and excuse me if I offend anyone if your tribal seal's not on here. We have the Hoopa Valley tribe, the Karuk tribe, the Klamath tribes I just mentioned, the Pit River tribe, the Yurok tribe, the Winnemem Wintu, the Norelmuk Wintu, and the Shasta Indian Nation. I'm sure there are others. There's some rancherias around that have a variety of Native American members. And Miller pointed out that back in his time, the tribes did not always get along. Of course, he read in some of his accounts how the tribes would attack each other, raid each other. Some of the tribes took slaves. And it was, as it was then, it is now as well. The tribes do not always all agree with each other, and these disagreements continue. Things have changed since then, and there have been a number of laws enacted that Anne listed, maybe not laws, but periods, including termination back in the 50s. And then we've seen some other issues come up, such as tribal trust. In my work for Trinity County, I was exposed quite a bit to the Hoopa Valley and Yurok tribe because of their federally reserved fishing rights on the Trinity and Klamath rivers. And the trust responsibility imposes an independent obligation on the federal government, all federal government agencies, I might add, but particularly the Interior Department, to remain loyal to Indians and to advance their interest, including their interest in self-government. Tribal trust is a big word, and you don't always understand how it works, but we'll take as an example this last summer, the Bureau of Reclamation planned to release additional water from the Trinity River to prevent another massive die-off of fish in the lower Klamath River that occurred in 2002. Because of this tribal trust interests of the federal government, despite litigation by Central Valley interests, the water flowed and the fish did not die this year. I think that shows a very significant, that this is a very significant issue. And the Bureau of Reclamation, which dammed and operates many of the dams in the state, in this case did the right thing because the because the tribal trust obligation that they have forced them to. There's also the implications of tribal water and fishing rights. This is from a lawsuit in 1997 with the Klamath Water Users Association, and essentially what the court said, based on a decision by the Interior and Commerce Departments in 1993, that the tribes have water rights dating back to time immemorial or when the tribes were established. I think the original language says something about 10,000 years. Right now we see that going on in the Upper Klamath Basin. There's been an adjudication of water rights there, and the Klamath tribes have received a priority for those water rights. And we've seen people who settled the area after World War II who gained subsequent junior water rights, and because of the shortage this year, the tribes are receiving the water that they would like for their tribal trust assets, their fish in the river, and the irrigators who do not have senior water rights have been cut off. So in a sense, the tables are being turned to a certain extent, but again, it's not even and it's not always the same. But that's a very clear example of how things have changed. Another thing that occurred was 1975, something called tribal self-determination. And most people don't know about this law, but it's very significant. Most of us have heard of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and one gentleman that I know who worked for one of the tribes for a number of years said he never heard anything from the Bureau of Indian Affairs until there was a satellite about to crash on Earth, and they got a notice from BIA, and that was the only thing he ever heard from BIA in all the years that he worked for the tribe. So BIA has not exactly been renowned for their effectiveness in government and really protecting the rights of the tribes. So Indian self-determination was an effort to basically give the tribes the right to use federal funds to protect their trust assets. It's become a very significant law, and actually during the Clinton administration, there was a team of 10 model tribes in the country that began to implement self-governance. The Hoopa Valley tribe was one of those 10 tribes. They helped the Interior Department write regulations to implement tribal self-determination, and it's become a very, very powerful thing. I saw it myself working on the Trinity River in the 80s. With the advent of self-governance, we saw the California Department of Fish and Game and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that were getting federal money to monitor fisheries on the Trinity River. The Hoopa Valley tribe, what they called 638'd their money. If you see, that's public law 93-638. So they basically took the money that the state and federal agencies were using to monitor those tribal trust assets, the fish in the Trinity River, and they used them themselves to build their fisheries departments, to hire their own people to do the work. It came as quite a shock to some of those federal and state employees who lost their jobs because of it, but the tribes essentially took back some of the power for themselves, and it goes on today. When I worked for Trinity County, I saw it in action. The county, again, is a local government agency, but it is an agency under the state of California. What I found is many times we would have meetings with various state and federal agencies and Indian tribes, and I thought we worked out deals, but then the tribes were able to actually go into government-to-government negotiations with the federal government, and they were able to obtain a different deal than we had all agreed on publicly. Whether I liked it or not, that's the way that it was, and things have indeed changed from what they used to be. Again, it's not all the same, but I think back in the 1800s when Joaquin Miller was around, he saw the tribes being decimated by massacres, by starvation, disease, essentially being pushed off their land. I think to a certain extent, some of the people in this area are now feeling threatened by some of the tribes because of some of the things that are going on regarding water rights. For instance, the Klamath Hydropower Settlement Agreement. There are a number of entities for and against it. My particular organization has no position on it, amazingly enough, but we see that there are some tribes in favor and there are other tribes against it. So there's not consensus there, and nothing is moving ahead at this point in time. Another issue where the tribes had a great deal of influence is locally the Karuk tribe spearheaded an effort to ban suction dredge mining in our rivers and streams. Again, whether you like it or not, the Karuk tribe managed to pull it off. And at this point in time, there is a ban on suction dredge mining. So people are feeling a bit threatened by some of these things, but at the same time, the tribes feel like they're regaining some of their past sovereignty. One of the other local issues that's got people very concerned is over Coho salmon in the Shasta and the Scott rivers. There's been some litigation filed there. Again, my organization is not involved in any of that, but it has people scared, and people are concerned, and it's an interesting situation. Another one that actually I am working on is the enlargement of Shasta Dam. The Winnemem-Wintu lost many of their cultural sites when the dam was inundated. Essentially, the men went off to war in World War II and came back, and their native land was gone. There are a few remaining cultural sites, but they are threatened by enlargement of the dam. The Winnemem-Wintu are not a federally recognized tribe, and so they don't have the kind of power that they might to stop this project. On the other hand, economics may seal the fate of the enlargement. These are just a couple of graphs, and they actually don't include Shasta Dam, but essentially the top graph shows how much water is available through conservation, recycling, and those kind of things compared to Sites Reservoir, Temperance Flat Reservoir. The bottom chart is the same project, Sites on the left, Temperance Flat on the San Joaquin in the middle, and recycling and conservation on the right. So the top is the amount of water available, the bottom is how much it's going to cost. If you look at those kind of numbers for Shasta Dam, it's the same thing. It's not a cost-effective buy, and it may not be that the Winnemem-Wintu will bring this project down. It may very well be the economics. So there really are no easy answers. Things have changed, and yet some things remain the same. Conflicts continue, but we all share the land together at this point in time. And so I would repeat what Rodney King had to say is, why can't we all get along? So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Greetings. 20 years ago, a friend suggested giving a recital of Joaquin Miller's Columbus poem at our local school celebrating Columbus Day of that year. Thus, an avid interest sparked in the bard, the American bard, a Celtic tradition, meaning in Celtic tradition, poet warrior, and suits Joaquin perfectly. Inspired, we devoted next several years co-writing The American, a screenplay based on the dramatic, lengthy life and times of this remarkable pathfinder, pusher of the consciousness envelope. While writing, of the consciousness envelope. While writing, new note. While writing and exploring Miller's fascinating life, we were guided with the invaluable assistance of Margaret, who kept us all authentic. Here are the following discoveries were appreciated. At school, one of Joaquin's earliest poems, refreshingly adolescent, it reminds one that once upon a time he was just another every boy before catapulting himself onto the world stage as desired. At school. The day is dark and cloudy too, and the mist is eddying around. My toes, they ache, you bet they do, as I hear the chill wind sound. The boys, they whisper and look about, and Will his moustache twirls. And Krona, he is now gone out, and I sit and look at the girls. And they look, and then I grin, and I look at Will and smile, but there is Krona coming in, and now I must study a while. But then the windows have no glass, and it is cold, dark, and cloudy too. But the time is hurrying past, and I have much to learn and to do. And here I'm called up to recite my cutter arithmetic, for I must study until the night, or get flogged with a stick. I guess when I'm as big as Dad, I'll leave this plaguey school. I'll make the teacher wish he had not made me mind his rule.
Can you clap after each performance?
No. But thank you. From childhood innocence to the grim horror of war and its tragic, devastating aftermath. After all was written as his brother John was leaving home to fight in the Civil War, and is to become eeringly prophetic. The apples are ripe in the orchard, the work of the reaper is done, and golden woodlands redden in the blood of the dying sun. At the cottage door, the grandsire sits pale in his easy chair, while the gentle wind of twilight plays with his silver hair. A woman is kneeling beside him, a fair young head is pressed in the first wild passion of sorrow against his aged breast. And far from the distance the faltering echoes come of the flying blast of trumpet and the rattling roll of drum. And the grandsire speaks in a whisper, the end no man can see, but we give him to his country, and we give our prayers to thee. The violets star the meadows, the rosebuds fringe the door, and over the grassy orchard, the pink-white blossoms pour. But the grandsire's chair is empty, the cottage is dark and still. There's a nameless grave in the battlefield, and a new one under the hill. And a pallid, tearless woman by the cold hearth sits alone, and the old clock in the corner ticks on with a steady drone. Almost a decade later, the haunting, forlorn, female fictional figure becomes transformed into his mother. Fiction becomes fact. In the following journal entry, August the 18th, 1870, New York, eve of sailing for Europe, seeking fame, fortune, and the realization of this lifelong dream of becoming a famous writer. August the 18th, 1870. Great event today. My brave good brother, who heard the roar of war way out yonder by the sounding Oregon, and came on here to see it through, is with me. He is dark-haired and very handsome. He dresses and looks just like those other fellows, though, and like Chinamen, one can hardly tell them apart. But, dear brave boy, he is not like those other fellows a bit. And how he and I once quarrelled over this war business. True, I can remember when we were both little lads and father talked to us about the slaves, how we planned together to steal the poor Negroes and help them away to the north. But when the war came and the armies went down, desolating the South, then with that fatality that has always followed me for getting on the wrong side, siding with the weak, I forgot my pity for the one and my larger pity for the other. And so my brother John shouldered his gun. We shook hands, and I never saw him any more till today. His name is on the rolls of New Jersey, a lieutenant only. We do not mention the war, his side won. But as with many another noble fellow, it has cost him his life, I fear. I can see death on his pale, gentle face. His deep blue eyes have lost their glory. What will mother say? And on that very note, an ode to wounded womanhood, the poignant poem, The Bravest Battle, where the personal morphs into the universal, and Mrs. Mary Miller becomes every woman. The Bravest Battle. The bravest battle that ever was fought, shall I tell you where and when? On the maps of the world you will find it not. 'Twas fought by the mothers of men. Nay, not with cannon of battle shot, with a sword and noble pen. Nay, not with eloquent words or thought, from mouths of wonderful men. But deep in a walled-up woman's heart, of a woman that would not yield, but bravely, silently bore a part. Lo, there is the battlefield. No marshalling troops, no bivouac song, no banner to gleam and wave. But oh, those battles, they last so long, from babyhood to the grave. Yet faithful still as the bridge of stars, she fights in a walled-up town, fights on and on in her endless wars, then silent, unseen, goes down. Oh, with banners and battle shot and soldiers to shout and praise, I tell you the kingliest victories were fought in those silent ways. O spotless woman in a world of shame, with splendid and silent scorn, go back to God as white as you came, the kingliest warrior born. From woman's blight to a light-hearted reverence, Joaquin, charming, another internationally famous celeb of the day, the actress Lily Langtry. To the Jersey Lily. If all God's world a garden were, and women were but flowers, if men were bees that busied there through endless summer hours, oh, I would hum God's garden through for honey till I came to you. The Dead Millionaire and the eternal gulf between seeing and not seeing. The Dead Millionaire. The gold that with sunlight lies in bursting heaps at dawn, the silver spilling from the skies at night to walk upon, the diamonds gleaming in the dew, he never saw, he never knew. He got some gold dug from the mud, some silver crushed from stones. The gold was red with dead men's blood, the silver black with groans. And when he died, he moaned aloud, "There'll be no pocket in my shroud." In the second stanza of the poem Adios, Joaquin, multifaceted Joaquin, clarifies his life's purpose with frustrated self-honesty. Could I but teach man to believe, could I but make small men to grow, to break frail spider webs that weave about their thews and bind them low, could I but sing one song and slay grim doubt, and then I could go my way, in tranquil silence, glad, serene, and satisfied from off the scene. But this disbelief, this doubt of God, this doubt of good, the damned spot will not out. And finally, Joaquin Miller's most popular poem, The Inspirational Columbus, with its profound, resounding theme message, sail on and on, or never give up, for nothing can defeat one except quitting. Coming from a race whose keynote is resignation, I resonated deeply with Joaquin's theme, and that it also reflects that quintessential American quality, vision, and the ability, will, faith, fortitude to actualize. Columbus. Behind him lay the grey Azores, behind the gates of Hercules. Before him, not the ghost of shores. Before him, only shoreless seas. The good mate said, now must we pray, for lo, the very stars are gone. Brave Admiral, speak, what shall I say? Why, say, sail on, and on. My men grow anxious day by day, my men grow ghastly, wan and weak. The stout mate thought of home, a spray of salt wave washed his swarthy cheek. What shall I say, brave Admiral, say, if we sight naught but seas at dawn? Why, you shall say at break of day, sail on, and on. They sailed and sailed, as winds might blow, until at last the blanched mate said, why, not even God would know, should I and all my men fall dead. These very winds forget their way, for God from these dread seas is gone. Now speak, brave Admiral, speak and say. He said, sail on, and on. They sailed, then spake the mate. This mad sea shows his teeth tonight. He curls his lip, he lies in wait with lifted teeth as if to bite. Brave Admiral, say but one good word, what shall we do when hope is gone? The words leapt like a leaping sword. Sail on, and on. Then, pale and worn, he kept his deck and peered through darkness. Ah, that night of all dark nights. And then a speck, a light, at last a light. It grew, a starlit flag unfurled. It grew to be time's burst of dawn. He gained a world, he gave that world its grandest lesson. On, sail on. Thank you.
Sorry for all the technical problems. I'm doing a double whammy. I'm going to go through this PowerPoint. I've never done one before, but then we're going to show a film. And the film is actually, I think it's about 55 minutes long, but I was going to just show like a portion of it, but I think since I'm the last person, watch 10 minutes, and if you want to go, or if you want to stay, because there's I guess dinner's after this, so just stay as long as you want. So let's see. Steve, I guess we're into the Muse, right? Joaquin's Muse. I'll just introduce maybe how I came about to making the film, or how I came about to be interested in Joaquin Miller. So, boom, there we go. So, raised in California in 4th grade, you study California Native American heritage. So from that point on, after reading Ishi, or being introduced to Ishi, I kind of became a history addict, and so Native California culture was part of my interest, along with just world history and anything to do with history. And that really informed a lot of my art projects, sculptures, films, paintings. There was always an interest in history. I lived in New Mexico for a long time. I was born and raised in Northern California, but I lived in New Mexico. So there I had the opportunity just to visit, so many different archaeological sites that you don't really find in California. A lot of Anasazi stuff. And I was a member of the American Rock Art Association at that time, so did a lot of touring, different sites, and people would always try to decipher what they meant, and it became obvious after a while that nobody really knows what they mean. I think they had 7 of the Pueblos try to interpret some petroglyphs at Chaco Canyon, and everybody had a different interpretation. But I love that stuff. Also, different trips to Europe, and I lived in Europe for a while. I did the same thing, went around looking for prehistoric art, and did a lot of touring to these Neolithic tombs. And the art I ended up doing mostly for a long time was what is called land art or environmental art. And so it's kind of like a combination of my interest in art history and environmentalism. So I did a lot of projects just out in nature. So they were things that weren't really brought into art galleries. They would exist just out in nature, and sometimes they would wither away. I'd photograph them. And so this is an example of a project I did at an art residency program in upstate New York. Shoe tree. And so with all this interest in history and, interest in, the 19th century and just what was happening in America and California, when I was in graduate school, I thought, wow, I realized, like even talking about Joaquin Miller here, it's like there's really no way any of us can really imagine what his life was like. You just really can't go back there. We can to a certain extent, but you just can't. There's just no way to know what it was like living out in outside of McLeod in a cabin with a Wintu woman and with 8 feet of snow. There's just no way to kind of go back there. But I decided, okay, I'm going to try as much as I can, just see what it was like living at that time period. So I went out and for my graduate project, I lived with the Amish in Missouri, and I met an Amish family that took me in, and I learned how to drive horses and take care of horses. So I set out on a 6-week trip with my horse, Flexi. Flexi was her name, and I had my Amish buggy and a little camping equipment, and I just would stay in little town squares and stuff. So I just kind of wanted to experience the time, like how long things took, just go point A to point B. So my project was really about travel in like 19th century technology. And so, and when I started to do more stuff in galleries, there was this like environmental connection, like with nature, because I spent my whole life in nature, just with my family, and so I would try to even bring nature into the gallery world. That's what this piece was kind of about. So then Joaquin Miller, his territory that we're talking about here is the territory that I spent most of my childhood in every summer with my family, because Trout Creek, which is out off Pilgrim Creek Road, where we'll kind of go near there on that tour on Sunday. That was actually my grandfather's favorite fishing place, so we would spend our summers there. And so that's kind of how I identify with this land for my just living here and my whole life being in touch with this landscape. And so as I got older, I read about Joaquin Miller in the 80s, and I read his book and just started thinking about this guy, being so young here, and the Muse, like he got in touch with this Muse, because that's when he started writing, as Stephen was talking about in his talk. And so what was that artistic muse that he got in touch with, And so I thought, okay, I'm going to try to make a film about this. Just what is it in the landscape? Because I'm an artist too, and I go to this landscape, and you, as an artist, you feel things, and then you try to take those feelings and you interpret them. And sometimes you don't know what they are, and that's why you even make the artwork, because the artwork is just a process to try to understand what you feel. So, and that's kind of what this film is like. It's if you watch the whole thing, there's some things that are kind of funny. There's some things that are kind of surreal. So it was just like an attempt to just be out in all the different places Joaquin Miller probably spent time in, and just kind of experiment with, what is the muse of this area that, not necessarily maybe the one that he was in touch with, but just a muse that's here. So that was my approach to the film. And then since we probably won't get a chance to talk about it afterwards, you can talk to me about it maybe tomorrow or tonight or something if you have any questions. So Casey Worrell was the actor, and I think we're just going to start it right now.